She was escorted out of first class not because she broke the rules, but because of the color of her skin. No yelling, no resistance, just quiet humiliation in front of an entire cabin of passengers who either looked away or silently approved. No one questioned it. No one thought twice. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't plead. She simply gathered her things and walked to the back of the plane, eyes forward, spine straight, as if the world hadn't just tried to erase her. But what no one realized, not the crew, not the passengers, not even the smug stranger who demanded she be moved, was that the woman they had just silenced was not a mistake in the system. She was the system. And by the time this plane lands, everything they think they know about status, power, and identity will be shattered. This isn't just a flight. It's the beginning of a reckoning. If you believe in stories that expose truth through silence, if you believe in justice that doesn't need to shout to be heard, then stay with us. Like, subscribe, and comment where you're watching from, and tell us, what would you have done if you saw this unfold at 35,000 feet? Soline Whitlow walked up the jet bridge with the poised elegance of someone who had earned her place in the world. Her navy wool coat, tailored perfectly to her form, moved like water with each step. She didn't wear brands. She didn't need them. Her heels tapped against the aluminum floor in a cadence of quiet certainty. But as she reached the aircraft door, a man in a gray cashmere blazer leaned toward his companion and muttered, just loud enough for her to hear, something about first class letting the help board through the front these days. His tone wasn't amused. It was resigned, like he was watching a tradition slowly rot. Soline said nothing. She didn't blink, didn't pause. She handed her boarding pass to the attendant, a blonde woman with a fixed smile and eyes that slid across Soline like a barcode scanner. There was no welcome, no warmth, just the sound of the beep and a glance toward the cabin. Soline stepped through the threshold. First class was a cocoon of neutral tones, polished metal, and hushed exclusivity. The kind of silence that wasn't natural but enforced, maintained like temperature or altitude. She walked to seat 1C, placed her carry-on below, removed her coat, and sat. No fanfare, no display. Still, eyes found her, not because she asked for them, but because she wasn't what they were used to. Not in this space, not in this skin. She reached for the seatbelt and paused when a flight attendant, different from the one at the gate, approached. The woman's uniform was flawless, her expression practiced. She didn't make eye contact. Without a word, she dropped a hot towel on Soline's tray table. It wasn't folded. It wasn't warm. It was damp, crumpled, and slapped down like a warning. A cloth napkin tossed with a kind of casual disdain that didn't need words. Soline's jaw tightened, but her face remained still. She placed the towel to the side, untouched. Across the aisle, a woman in pearls laughed at something her husband whispered. Further back, the clink of champagne met soft chuckles. The plane had not yet taken off, but the cabin had taken shape, and Soline already understood her role. She was the anomaly, the mistake no one would admit aloud, but everyone would signal through tone, glance, posture. A second attendant passed by offering drinks. He poured for every seat but hers. Soline watched a flute of champagne go to 1A, then to 1D, then to 2A. When she caught his eye and raised a brow, he nodded and turned away. No apology, no acknowledgement. It wasn't a service oversight. It was deliberate. Beneath her calm, something in Soline began to coil. Not anger, not yet, but memory, recognition. She had sat in too many boardrooms filled with the same kind of smirks, the same brand of doubt wrapped in etiquette. They always assumed politeness was a shield against accountability. Soline opened her leather folder. Inside were reports, financial summaries, acquisition proposals, a signed memorandum from her legal team. All of it typed in fine, serifed, black ink. She scanned the page, not for content, but for focus. She needed a center, because she could already feel this flight wasn't going to be quiet. Her seatmate arrived next. A man in his 50s with salt white hair and a navy vest. He glanced at her, frowned, and looked back down at his boarding pass as if expecting it to change. He placed his briefcase in the overhead bin, sat, and shifted his shoulders away. Soline didn't look at him. She didn't need to. His discomfort came off him in waves, as if by sitting beside her, he had been demoted. When the final boarding call echoed through the cabin, another woman entered, mid-40s, red lipstick, diamond studs. She glanced towards Soline's row and let out a breath, sharp and theatrical, then whispered something to the attendant. Both women glanced at Soline. Then the attendant shook her head. The woman's eyes narrowed. Another wave of laughter came from the middle row. Soline hadn't said a word since boarding, and yet somehow she had managed to provoke the entire front cabin. That was the magic of existing in a place no one thought you deserved. You didn't have to move. Just being there was enough. She reached for the safety pamphlet, unfolded it, and began to read. She read each section as if it mattered, as if oxygen masks and inflatable rafts were worth memorizing. Behind the laminated paper, her hands were steady, but her chest burned. It wasn't rage. Rage was loud. This was something deeper, older. It was silence trained to behave. Soline remained upright, her eyes focused on the seat back in front of her, one hand resting on her leather folder, the other clutching the edge of the armrest with quiet precision. She hadn't been offered a drink. She hadn't been offered anything. But she expected nothing now. Expectations had a weight, and she had learned to leave them behind when crossing thresholds like these. The same attendant who had earlier delivered the limp towel returned, her posture now more relaxed, her eyes sharper. She leaned into the aisle and gave Soline a cursory glance before asking, with a tone too polished to be casual, "Are you certain you're on the right flight?" Her words were sugar-coated, but the poison seeped through the smile. Soline didn't react. She simply raised her boarding pass from the folder and handed it over. The attendant looked at it longer than necessary, then handed it back without apology, adding, "We've just had a few mix-ups lately. You don't exactly look like the average guest in this section." The words lingered like smoke, intended to smother. Soline inhaled quietly and exhaled slower, her face an untouched canvas of calm. Moments later, the man beside her shifted noisily, dragging the edge of his newspaper closer to his chest, and then folding it with an exaggerated sigh. His movements were calculated, designed to draw attention, and when she turned slightly toward him, he didn't miss a beat. "I don't mean to be rude," he said, gesturing vaguely toward her with a wave of two fingers, "but there's a rather overwhelming scent. Something like coconut oil, or maybe shea butter." He paused, sniffed the air theatrically, and added, "Do you use that sort of thing? I'm quite sensitive to strong fragrances. Triggers my allergies, you see." Then, as if offering a solution rather than deepening the insult, he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a crystal bottle of cologne, spraying it into the air between them in short, aggressive bursts. The scent was sharp, bitter citrus with a chemical finish, and it hit the back of Soline's throat like steel. She didn't move, didn't blink. Her body remained still while her mind stepped sideways, storing this moment with the others. The man adjusted his posture with satisfaction, muttered something about needing to breathe properly, and resumed reading his paper. Soline turned back to the window. Outside, the sun was beginning to break through the upper cloud layer, turning the sky into streaks of gold and blue. The light was sharp, but it softened nothing. Her reflection in the glass stared back at her, eyes focused, jaw tight, the curve of her lips held in that trained, perfect neutrality. The air around her seemed colder than before. Time moved differently here, stretched between indignities. Further down the aisle, laughter erupted from a group of 3 passengers across the way. One of them glanced toward Soline, then leaned in to whisper something. The others smiled. Not cruel smiles, worse, indulgent ones. The kind people wore when speaking of something amusing, ridiculous, beneath consideration. Soline didn't need to hear the words. She had heard them all before. She felt them in the way people tilted their heads when looking at her, the way their hands tightened around crystal stems, the way they corrected their posture when she passed by, as if her presence was a test they hadn't studied for and hoped wouldn't be graded. The second attendant returned, this time with a silver tray of canapes. She moved methodically, offering options to every row, describing each hors d'oeuvre with detail and cheer. When she reached Soline, she hesitated, then looked down at her clipboard. "Ah," she said, voice a little higher than before. "Your meal preference wasn't logged. We normally get dietary notes with these seats." Soline opened her mouth to answer, but the attendant continued, "I'll just bring you the vegan option. That should be safe." She disappeared before Soline could respond. The man beside her chuckled softly and said, almost to himself, "They never quite get it right for surprise guests." He didn't look at her. He didn't need to. The words weren't meant to be challenged, just released into the air like spores. Soline sat motionless, each word crawling across her skin like the slow edge of a blade. She reached into her folder and pulled out a small notepad. The pages were blank. She didn't write. She didn't need to. The act of opening it, of flipping through clean pages, gave her a moment to anchor herself. It reminded her she was real, that her story existed outside this aircraft, that this moment, this cramped, manufactured cruelty, was temporary. The cabin lights dimmed slightly as the aircraft entered its cruise. Passengers reclined. Some pulled sleep masks over their eyes. Others watched in-flight movies or scrolled silently on their tablets. In seat 1C, Soline sat as upright as when she had boarded, her tray table still folded, her food untouched. Her fingers remained laced in her lap, a single knuckle twitching in time with the overhead hum. Inside, however, the storm gathered silently around seat 1C. Soline sat rigid, her posture uncompromised by the turbulence of hostility that continued to unfold around her. She had felt discomfort before, had endured exclusion, endured dismissal, but this was escalation. Without warning, the younger flight attendant reappeared. Her footsteps were too quick, too deliberate, her face too stiff. She wasn't alone this time. Walking beside her was another woman, slightly older, with a pinched face and an air of rank that clung to her uniform like a second badge. This was the purser, the senior flight attendant, and her presence meant one thing: confrontation disguised as protocol. Soline looked up. She did not rise, did not speak. She simply met their eyes with the unwavering calm of someone who had predicted this exact performance minutes before it began. The purser's voice was clipped, devoid of warmth, rehearsed like a script written by someone who expected resistance and had been trained to neutralize it quickly. "We need to verify something," she said, then gestured towards Soline's lap. "Please produce your boarding pass again." Soline did not flinch. She reached into her folder with slow, deliberate motion and handed the same ticket she had already shown twice to the younger attendant. The purser didn't even look at it. She passed it to her colleague, who scanned it quickly with a handheld device, then turned the screen to her superior. They exchanged a look. It was not the look of confusion. It was the look of performance. The look of people who had found no evidence of guilt, but intended to proceed with accusation anyway. The purser tilted her head and said, loud enough for several rows to hear, "There's a discrepancy here. Your name doesn't match the profile we had expected in this seat." Soline raised an eyebrow. Her name was printed clearly. Her ID matched. Her booking had been confirmed. But this wasn't about the data. This was about the perception of legitimacy. The purser continued, "We've had incidents of ticket manipulation in recent months, especially with people misunderstanding digital upgrades. For safety, we'll need to reassign your seat while we sort it out." The words were false concern cloaked in bureaucracy. Around them, passengers turned their heads. Some subtly, some openly. No one intervened. A man across the aisle adjusted his glasses to observe better. A woman 2 rows back pulled her shawl tighter and leaned toward her companion, whispering. Soline remained silent. She could feel the collective gaze pressing down like weight. This wasn't an inquiry. It was a demonstration. The purser had no intention of resolving anything. She had come to reduce her, to label, to question, to name her as an inconvenience that needed managing. And the final blow came next, subtle in tone, devastating in implication. The purser leaned in slightly and said, not quietly, "Miss, or ma'am, we need you to comply. You're creating disruption." She hadn't used her name. Not once. Not even when she held the ticket with her full identity printed in bold black ink. She had addressed her the way one might refer to lost luggage or an unclaimed coat. That erasure cut deeper than any slur. To not be named was to not be acknowledged, to not exist as a person. Soline's gaze sharpened. She inhaled slowly, holding the breath at the peak of her lungs, and then let it out in silence. Her hands, still calm, still folded in her lap, gave no sign of the churn inside her. This was not the first time she had been asked to shrink, to prove herself again in spaces where others were presumed valid without evidence. But it was the most public. She turned slightly in her seat and gave the purser a look of measured defiance, one that did not raise her voice but dismantled the accusation simply by refusing to crumble under it. The purser did not retreat. She gestured again to the boarding pass. "If you're unwilling to assist, I'll have to make a note for the captain," she added. Her voice had shifted from polite coldness to bureaucratic threat. Behind them, a passenger cleared his throat, sensing something but offering nothing. A pair of teenage boys in the bulkhead row whispered and smirked. Soline reached for the boarding pass again, placed it back in her folder, and returned it to her bag with the same care she had arrived with. Then she crossed her legs and looked out the window. The message was clear: you will not move me. Not physically. Not psychologically. Not on your terms. The purser stood for a beat longer, waiting for permission to escalate. But Soline's refusal was not violent, not loud, not unruly. It was composed. It was elegant. It was uncooperative in the most inconvenient way. And that, more than anything, left them uncertain. They left. No apology. No acknowledgement. No resolution. Just withdrawal, sharp and silent. As they moved down the aisle, the whispers grew again. One passenger, emboldened by distance, muttered, "They should just sort her out and be done with it." Another chuckled and murmured, "This is why they need stricter screening." Soline heard it all. She catalogued it with clinical precision. Not to remember, to hold, to carry forward. This moment had not broken her, but it had sharpened something. A new edge honed against the rust of old wounds. A woman like Soline sitting in seat 1C had already stretched their assumptions to a breaking point, and now those assumptions, though unspoken, were validated by the uniformed authority of a flight crew that had treated her like a clerical error. As the attendants disappeared behind the curtain separating the galley from the front cabin, Soline knew this was not the end of their performance. It was a brief intermission, and the second act would be crueler. The seat beside her remained occupied by the same man with the cologne and the practiced disdain. He had not spoken since the purser's visit, but his satisfaction hung thick in the space between them. His body leaned slightly away from her, his elbow angled toward the aisle, his legs crossed tightly as though proximity alone might stain him. She could feel the energy shift when another attendant reappeared, this one older, a man with a narrow build and the stiff gait of someone who prided himself on formality. He did not approach with kindness. He stood beside her row and addressed her without eye contact, his voice controlled and hollow, devoid of any acknowledgement of who she was or what had just occurred. He announced that there had been a request from a passenger in 1A who was experiencing discomfort and had expressed concern about spending the duration of the flight seated in visual proximity to someone creating unease in the cabin. The phrasing was deliberate, sterile, carefully constructed to disguise the message beneath. Someone did not want to look at her, and because they did not want to look at her, she would be moved. Soline felt the absurdity rise like bile. The idea that her presence alone could be framed as a disturbance was not new. What stunned her was the boldness, the fact that they would move her after confirming her boarding pass, after acknowledging her seat assignment, after offering no proof that she had done anything but sit in silence. She was not being relocated due to behavior. She was being reassigned because someone else's discomfort outweighed her right to exist in the space she had paid for. The attendant gestured down the aisle, indicating the new seat assignment toward the rear of the plane. Not premium economy. Not business. Coach. She asked if the seat was by a window. He replied curtly that it was middle. When she asked why she was not offered another seat in first class, the answer was mechanical. Full cabin. No alternatives. The words barely reached her. Her mind buzzed with static. Her heart beat evenly, but her breath caught in the cage of her ribs. Every part of her wanted to resist, to stand, to speak the truth that none of them had the courage to admit aloud. But she remained seated. She looked at the overhead light, then at the aisle, then at the ceiling, and finally at the man still spraying himself with cologne as though her existence had left a residue in the air. She knew, without being told, that if she refused, it would escalate. Security would be summoned, headlines would be written, and the story would not be told in her favor. She had lived this pattern before in boardrooms, in customs lines, in hotels where they assumed she was housekeeping instead of the keynote speaker. Every time she raised her voice, she was labeled angry. Every time she defended her dignity, she was made to prove she had any. She stood. She gathered her coat. She retrieved her folder, her bag, and her silence. And she walked the full length of the aircraft down the aisle under the weight of 40 pairs of eyes. She passed rows of passengers who pretended not to see her, who studied their screens and whispered beneath their breath, who saw in her movement not injustice, but confirmation of their bias. She reached the back of the plane, row 36, seat E, a middle seat between a sleeping man in a hoodie and a woman who wore earbuds and flinched when Soline sat down. The space was smaller, the air thicker, the seat tighter. She had been displaced, not because of a mistake, but because someone more palatable had claimed her space. And the airline, without resistance, had agreed. The woman beside her lifted her arm to let Soline pass, then returned to scrolling on her phone. No acknowledgement, no curiosity, just a small movement of disapproval, as if she sensed she was now involved in something inconvenient. Soline folded her coat into a square, placed it behind her lower back, and stared forward. Her knees touched the seat ahead, her elbows tucked tight. Her bag sat wedged beneath the seat like contraband. The next meal service came 40 minutes later. An attendant rolled the cart down the narrow aisle, stopping only to drop pre-selected meals onto trays without asking. When the cart reached Soline's row, the attendant placed a cold sandwich on the tray in front of her. It was still in plastic, the bread pale and slightly wet from condensation, the filling indistinguishable. Soline looked up and asked what the other options were. The attendant, not looking up from the cart manifest, replied that her meal had already been chosen based on what was listed. She asked who had made that choice. The attendant replied it was based on the system. She asked if she could see the menu. The attendant said there were none left. Her seat, 36E, had become a purgatory of flesh and fabric, a coffin-sized confinement for a woman who once moved through marble halls and glass towers with the grace of silent authority. Now surrounded by the smell of plastic-wrapped food and the stale breath of strangers, she remained still, not because she was calm, but because movement would break her. Her silence was now an act of war. The woman beside her, having just finished her reheated chicken, let out a bored sigh and pulled out a book with a gilded spine. Its title was printed in French, the kind of French that didn't come from school, but from summers in Provence and Christmases in Geneva. As she adjusted her scarf and turned a page with delicate fingers, her eyes wandered sideways toward Soline's tray, where the untouched sandwich sat like a cold rebuke. Then she smiled, tight-lipped and condescending, and leaned just slightly toward her. "If you're not going to eat," she whispered with the kind of familiarity reserved for charity cases, "perhaps I could explain what it is. Some of the ingredients are in French. It's easy to get confused." Her tone was syrupy, designed to humiliate under the guise of assistance. Her voice carried the insult not in volume, but in precision. The implication struck cleanly. "Someone like you isn't used to cuisine like this." Soline didn't respond. Her eyes remained on the window where the sky had turned from blue to obsidian, dotted with stars that blinked without pity. The woman returned to her book, satisfied by her own civility. Soline sat motionless. She could have said something. She could have spoken a string of fluent Parisian French, so sharp it could slice the gold trim from that book spine. She could have told the woman about her years at the Sorbonne, about her lectures in Lyon, about the fact that the phrase on the wrapper, sandwich au fromage, wasn't even real cuisine, but a packaged product barely worth comment. But silence, in this moment, was her choice. She would not perform to prove what was already hers. 10 rows ahead, another kind of cruelty began to brew. A cluster of passengers had overheard the purser earlier when she had consulted her list for reassignments. In that list, Soline's name had been read aloud, not to her, but among them. Her name said with an accent that stripped it of elegance and twisted it into parody. One man, broad-chested and sunburned, had chuckled at the sound of it and leaned toward his seatmate. "Did you hear that?" he said, voice half-laugh. "Soline Whitlow. Sounds like someone you'd find scrubbing floors in a Western saloon, not flying first class." His companion smirked, adding, "Maybe she's got a cousin named Clementine washing windows out back." The laughter was not loud, but it was venomous. It traveled in smirks, in exchanged glances, in the way a flight attendant grinned, without knowing why when she passed by. The joke had taken root, its cruelty quietly sanctioned by the social order in the cabin, where certain names were deemed refined and others were deemed functional. Soline's name had become a punchline in a language she had mastered, a melody they had chosen to hum as mockery. She hadn't heard the comment directly, but she felt it, the way one feels a drop of water falling before the storm. Disdain, like heat, traveled. The attendant returned down the aisle, now collecting trays. When she reached Soline, she reached quickly, grabbed the untouched sandwich, and remarked with a smile that was too wide, "Didn't feel adventurous tonight?" Then she winked. "It's okay. Not everyone has the palate for French." Her voice was louder than necessary, and the woman with the book chuckled behind her page. Soline stared up at the attendant with the slow precision of someone calculating the exact moment a dam would break. But she said nothing. She handed over the tray. Her hands did not shake. Her breath did not hitch. But the humiliation etched deeper. An announcement came through the cabin speaker. A soft chime. Then the flight supervisor's voice, listing connecting gates and passenger names whose baggage needed verification. Soline's name was read again. Not by mistake. Not by necessity. It was read twice, as if someone had flagged it. The voice mispronounced it again, stretching out the syllables into something flat and unfamiliar, turning it into a foreign object, spoken over a microphone for 200 ears to hear. A man 3 rows ahead chuckled and repeated the name under his breath, like a joke. Another said, "Must be fake. Doesn't sound real." A third laughed and added, "Sounds like a cleaning product." Their voices faded, but the damage remained. Soline sat, anchored in her seat, surrounded by mockery disguised as manners, by prejudice disguised as error, by cruelty disguised as custom. She had been downgraded, displaced, stripped of the recognition of her name, her origin, her dignity. They had taken her seat. They had taken her space. And now they were trying to take her identity, not by force, but by laughter, not by rage, but by ridicule. And still, she did not flinch. Every moment from the gate to the galley had left a mark, cut by words, branded by silences, and she wore them now like invisible chains across her chest. They hadn't just moved her. They hadn't just mocked her name or her heritage. They had reduced her existence to a question, then to an error, and now, with a growing weight of scrutiny pressing in again, to a suspicion. It began with a glance. Another flight attendant, this one new, taller, sharper-jawed, clipped in voice, stopped near her row, holding a tablet in one hand and looking across the seats without speaking. He stared at her longer than necessary, as if waiting for a sign. Then he leaned toward his colleague and murmured something inaudible. The younger attendant nodded and disappeared through the curtain. Soline did not react. She had seen this kind of choreography before, quiet movements laced with meaning, bureaucracy cloaked in suspicion. A moment later, the sharp-jawed man returned with a folded printout and a colder demeanor. He crouched near her row and held the paper toward her without greeting. "MS. Whitlow," he said flatly, "we've had a flag in the system on your profile." His voice was not accusatory, but it was not courteous. It carried the brittle tension of someone who already doubted what they were saying, but planned to say it anyway. She looked at the paper. It was a passenger manifest, her name printed near the top, next to a code she recognized from corporate travel tiers. VIP Black. Top level. Top billing. No conditions. No questions. There seems to be a mismatch between your current boarding photo and the one we have on file, he continued, glancing from the paper to her face. You look somewhat different. Soline's breath did not quicken, but the stillness in her chest deepened. She looked at him squarely. He clarified, we've had identity fraud before. Passes used by family or staff members. If you could verify with an additional form of ID, we can close the flag. The implication snapped into place with brutal clarity. She did not look like someone with that status. Not that name, not that seat, and now not that face. Is this routine? She asked. Her voice was soft but unyielding. The man hesitated. We do it when something feels off. He said it like instinct was policy. When she offered him her passport, her name perfectly matched, her photo clear and current. He nodded, but remained crouched. If you don't mind, he added after a pause, do you have the card used for purchase? We've had issues with third-party bookings. His words were vague but deliberate. Soline understood what he meant, the assumption that the payment hadn't come from her, that her presence here was funded by someone else, someone whose status they believed more legitimate than hers. She asked, what's the concern? My ID matches. My name is cleared. But the man didn't blink. We'd just like to confirm everything lines up internally. So she handed him the same card she had used to purchase the ticket, a black titanium slab embossed with her initials. His fingers hesitated when they touched it, as if realizing only now what kind of card it was. Not a credit card, a status symbol, the kind that unlocked doors before one even knocked. But still, he scanned it into his device and waited for a response. She stared forward, her face unreadable, but inside, the churn began again. This was not about policy. It was about doubt. Doubt enforced not by data, but by optics. She did not look like someone they were trained to expect, and so everything about her became subject to confirmation. Her face, her name, her finances, her existence. When the scan cleared, the man handed the card back. Thank you, Ms. Whitlow, he said, standing. But there was no apology, no acknowledgement of the humiliation, only the sterile conclusion of a process they'd never have subjected another passenger to. We'll update the system for future flights, he added, almost kindly. She offered no reply. Her hands returned to her lap, her eyes to the window, her silence more absolute than before. The passengers beside her pretended to sleep, their bodies angled away as though contact might stain them. The woman with the French book had turned her head toward the aisle, feigning disinterest. The man in the hoodie still slept with his face pressed against the plastic wall. No one had witnessed the moment fully, but Soline knew what it was. A public stripping of credibility disguised as procedure. The plane continued across the Atlantic, a silent blade cutting the black sky. In the galley, the crew whispered. She felt their eyes brush across her row every time the curtain stirred. She was no longer simply the woman who had caused a disruption in first class. She had become a quiet case study, a reminder to them all that appearances, even when challenged, must fit the mold or be investigated. It was not about one attendant. It was not about one comment. It was the ecosystem they upheld together, wordlessly, ruthlessly. Every act had been sanctioned by omission, every insult protected by the armor of ambiguity. Beneath the silence she wore like armor, the pressure had reached a point where the structure could no longer contain the force it was meant to suppress. They had humiliated her, denied her, diminished her, and when that failed, they had interrogated her very identity. And still she had endured, but she would not remain invisible. Not anymore. Not after this. As the attendant disappeared beyond the curtain with her identification still echoing in digital logs, Soline reached into her carry-on and pulled out her phone. She turned the screen just enough to block the glow from others nearby. Then, with 2 taps and a long press, she triggered a line that had been dormant for nearly a year. It rang once, then silence. A quiet voice on the other end responded immediately. She spoke only 3 words, her tone low and even. "Activate emergency protocol." The voice paused, then answered with a clipped affirmative before cutting the line. The phone disappeared back into her coat. She exhaled once, closing her eyes briefly, as if bracing for turbulence. But what followed was not wind. It was something else entirely. 37 seconds after her call ended, a discreet vibration hummed across the wrist of a crew member up front. Then another, and another. Devices tucked in uniforms began to flash with silent pings, each one marked with the same 6-word command from the executive alert channel of the airline's governing board. "Do not engage. Passenger is secured." Within seconds, the internal manifest updated across the cabin crew's digital interface. Her name reappeared in bold. Her designation was no longer VIP Black. It was now marked Class 0, a designation reserved for the airline's primary investors and board-level authority holders. Beneath it, escalation prohibited. Defer to executive team. The lead purser, standing in the galley with a cup of tea still warm in her palm, read the alert once, then again, her mouth parting slightly. Her fingers trembled as she turned the device toward her colleague, who blinked at the screen, pale now under the fluorescent lights. In a single moment, the weight of the mistake crashed down on them, not in fury, but in certainty. The woman they had removed from first class. The woman they had asked to reprove her identity. The woman they had spoken of with whispered mockery and empty apologies. She was not a guest. She was not a customer. She was a principal. A name engraved not just on a passenger list, but on the acquisition agreements that made this very route possible. She was not flying with them. They were flying under her. In the forward cabin, the captain received the message simultaneously. His fingers paused mid-log, then slowly closed the tablet in front of him. The update contained no details, only a directive, but one that could not be ignored. He rose without hesitation and entered the first-class galley, bypassing startled crew and stepping into the aisle with purpose. Meanwhile, in the economy cabin, the tone of flight attendants shifted instantly. The ones who had looked past her, over her, through her, now began to glance back, waiting, calculating. They were no longer certain of the hierarchy they had defended. The chain of assumed power had fractured. The person they had erased now loomed over them without lifting a hand. One attendant approached slowly, face taut with forced calm. She leaned into the row where Solene sat and spoke with a smile so thin it could have been paper. "Ms. Whitlow," she said, voice barely audible over the white noise of the engines, "the captain would like a moment of your time. If you would please." She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. Solene stood without hurry. She lifted her scarf, collected her bag, and stepped into the aisle with the same composure she had maintained since she was dragged into the margins. Except now, every step forward pulled the air out of the cabin. The murmurs began. Passengers turned in confusion. Some recognized the sudden tension. Others simply sensed the current had shifted. She walked the same aisle they had exiled her down. But this time, she did not carry the weight of shame. She carried silence like a gavel. When she reached the curtain, it parted for her without being touched. The crew in the galley stood aside. The purser, now pale, opened her mouth to speak but found her throat dry. She couldn't form words. Solene stopped, met her gaze once, and tilted her head slightly. It wasn't a glare. It wasn't even reprimand. It was clarity, the look of someone who remembered everything and needed to say nothing. She moved past them and entered the flight deck corridor where the captain was waiting. "I apologize," he said. "The manifest should have." She raised a hand gently. "Handled," she replied. But she made no announcement, issued no demand, and wore no visible crown. Instead, she allowed the mechanisms around her to catch up, to realize slowly and painfully what they had ignored, disrespected, and discarded. Her call had been placed. The signal had been received. And now, the system was beginning to correct itself, not through panic, but through acknowledgement. At the front of the cabin, the captain sat behind the closed door of the cockpit, reviewing the follow-up directive that had just arrived from Skycor's Global Executive Board. The message was brief but impossible to misunderstand. Issue announcement immediately. Executive presence confirmed. Level 0 visibility authorized. This was no longer a quiet internal flag. This was a formal directive to acknowledge, publicly and without condition, the presence of a corporate executive whose role had not just shaped the future of this airline, but who now held its reputation in her hands. The captain keyed into the intercom, his voice smooth and practiced, but his cadence slower now, deliberate, as if weighing every word before release. The chime echoed across the cabin. The lights above flickered to life in sync with the alert tone. Then his voice filled the plane. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "we'd like to take a moment to extend a very special welcome aboard this flight to one of our distinguished executive partners." Passengers stirred, heads lifted from pillows, screens were paused. "It is our privilege to host Ms. Solene Whitlow, Chief Executive Officer of Skycor Holdings, on board today. Ms. Whitlow has been instrumental in forging our latest global infrastructure agreement, including the very airframe you're flying on this evening." A few gasps broke the quiet. One or two heads whipped around. A nervous ripple flowed through first class, then into business, and then economy. The name, until now just a point of ridicule, had become a monument. "We're grateful for her trust in our fleet," the captain continued, "and we ask that all passengers and crew extend their appreciation and respect accordingly. Thank you." The announcement ended, but the silence it left behind was deafening. In row 36, every eye now turned toward her, including those who had mocked her accent, questioned her presence, ridiculed her name. They stared with a stunned realization that the woman they had dismissed was the very architect of their comfort, the very person who had the power to write or erase careers with a single stroke of a pen. Solene remained seated. She didn't shift. She didn't turn. She didn't need to. The announcement had already done what centuries of protest often could not. It forced them to look and see. Further forward, the cabin crew scrambled behind the galley curtain, devices in hand, eyes darting from screen to screen. The purser stood motionless, her breath caught between protocol and panic. The manifest was now glowing red, where Solene's name sat under the header, Executive Directive, no alteration permitted. The digital ID photo, the same one she had been told didn't resemble her, now filled the tablet screen with an unmistakable caption: Owner Representation Level 0 Access. It was the highest tier in the company's security hierarchy, a classification above board members, above regional CEOs, above division directors. Only 4 individuals in the world held it, and one of them had just been asked to prove she belonged. In first class, the man who had sprayed his cologne to mask her presence now sat frozen, his jaw slack. The woman with the French book had put it down, her face flushed with the realization that her smug correction had been an insult delivered to a woman who likely spoke more French than she had ever heard outside a menu. The cluster of men who had joked about her name were now whispering among themselves. Their laughter vanished, their confidence cracked. One of them muttered an apology beneath his breath that no one would hear. Another tapped on the crew call button, uncertain why. And somewhere in the forward rows, an older woman closed her magazine slowly and said, almost in awe, that name sounded familiar. The shift in atmosphere was absolute. It was no longer about race or class or assumed status. It was about the colossal failure of everyone on board to recognize value, without the packaging they were conditioned to trust. Solene's worth hadn't increased with the announcement. It had always been there. But now it had become undeniable, and the reality of that power echoed through every corner of the fuselage like a recalibrated heartbeat. Solene lifted her tablet again and resumed working. She reviewed language in the ongoing diversity and equity initiative scheduled for deployment next quarter. She flagged a section that addressed employee conduct training modules and added a note. Simulations must include role-based perception bias. Include cross-cabin scenarios with ranking protocols removed. She saved it, then moved to the next item. Inside the cabin, the mood had shifted from quiet to silent unease, the kind of tension that made people sit straighter, breathe quieter, and avoid eye contact not because they were bored, but because they were ashamed. Every movement felt slower. Every glance felt weighted. The captain's announcement had not only shattered their assumptions, it had forced them to confront the fragile scaffolding of their own entitlement. And the system, having recalibrated to truth, now began to respond in kind. In the forward galley, the lead purser stood with her back to the rest of the crew, her hands resting lightly on the counter, her face pale. She had not spoken since the manifest updated. She had not moved since the announcement. The younger attendant beside her whispered her name twice, then gave up. Moments later, a message pinged across the internal communication line. Captain requests immediate presence of lead crew. She straightened slowly, adjusted the collar of her uniform, and walked forward, each step heavier than the last. Behind her, 2 other attendants followed, the ones who had stood silently during the boarding pass interrogation and the identity verification spectacle, their expressions now drawn with the weight of implication. The cockpit door opened. They entered. It closed behind them. For several minutes, the cabin remained untouched. Then the purser reappeared, alone, her face stiff, her steps no longer measured. She paused at the galley, removed her name badge from her chest with trembling fingers, and placed it on the counter. The action was small, almost unnoticeable, but final. One by one, the other 2 attendants followed. They said nothing. They did not cry. They did not protest. They placed their badges beside hers, gathered their personal bags from the service locker, and stepped into the jump seats at the rear of the aircraft. It was understood. The orders had been given. At the upcoming stopover, they would be escorted from the aircraft by ground security, not arrested, not paraded, but quietly removed, like clutter being swept from an immaculate showroom. The silence that followed was unbearable, like the moment after a verdict is read in court and no one breathes because the truth has already struck and speaking would only spread the dust. In the main cabin, passengers sat in wordless discomfort. The man who had ridiculed Soline's name was now staring at the seat in front of him, unmoving, his cocktail untouched. His seatmate, who had joined in the mockery with a whisper and a smirk, now scrolled slowly through his phone, his screen dimmed, his face cast in dull regret. Across the aisle, the woman with the French novel had tucked it away and now held a blanket tight around her shoulders, eyes fixed on nothing. No one had spoken to Soline. No one dared. She sat still, the same as before, her tablet closed now, resting flat against her knees. Her silence was no longer misunderstood. It was revered. Her decision to remain in that seat, in that row, was no longer read as passivity. It was power in its most unshakable form. Behind the scenes at Skycorps' corporate hub, the incident had already triggered a ripple of alerts and corrective protocols. The internal security team flagged 3 passenger accounts for expedited review. Those who had instigated or participated in discriminatory behavior toward Soline. Their loyalty statuses were frozen, their frequent flyer miles suspended, their profiles marked for audit. The system, once used to elevate them, now quietly began to dismantle their privileges. Emails were drafted. Review boards were assembled. A memo titled Passenger Ethics and Conduct Enforcement Immediate Action Required was circulated through department heads with Soline's name redacted but her title highlighted in red. There would be no delay, no slow deliberation. Skycorps, at her silent signal, moved faster than ever before. By the time the plane began its descent, the purser and the 2 attendants had already unstrapped themselves from their jump seats, gathered their belongings, and waited at the exit hatch. The captain made another announcement, formal and crisp, informing the passengers that a minor crew rotation would take place during the stop and that all passengers were to remain seated during the process. No details were offered. No names were mentioned. But everyone on board knew. The man in first class, who had once asked if she was lost, now sat with a newspaper trembling in his hands, trying and failing to appear indifferent. The murmurs that followed were not judgmental. They were frightened, because they now understood that their comments, their behaviors, their assumptions had not dissolved into the air. They had been recorded by memory, by system, and by consequence. As the plane touched down on the tarmac and taxied into position, 3 uniformed airport officers waited by the service door. They did not enter the cabin. They didn't need to. The purser stepped out first, her spine straight, her bag at her side. She nodded once to no one in particular and descended the stairs. The 2 attendants followed, wordless, heavy-footed. There was no confrontation, no dramatic farewell, just absence, left behind like discarded uniforms. The aircraft climbed back into the sky, lighter in weight but heavier in memory, carrying within its hull a quiet reckoning that hummed louder than the engines. The atmosphere in the cabin had transformed from entitlement to introspection, and silence now hung not as tension but as reverence. There was no applause, no apologies shouted across aisles, just reflection, the quiet kind, the real kind, the kind that burrowed beneath pride and stayed. Solene remained seated where she had chosen, still near the emergency exit, still cloaked in that quiet that no longer asked permission. Her presence was now untouchable, but she made no attempt to assert it. She let the silence do what words could not, restore balance, not by demand, but by clarity. As the flight neared its final destination, a soft knock came at her side. It was not urgent. It was not rehearsed. The younger flight attendant, Clara, her badge had once read, stood there holding a folded note in both hands. She did not speak. She did not look away. She simply offered the envelope, nodded, and stepped back. Solene accepted it with a brief glance. She placed it in her lap, but did not open it yet. She sensed what it was, not an excuse, but something else. Something earned. The descent continued. Wheels met runway. The plane slowed to a smooth halt, and the cabin erupted in the usual flurry of buckles and overhead bins. Yet this time, the rush was subdued, the energy cautious. No one spoke too loudly. No one looked too directly. Everyone had heard what silence could mean. In the VIP lounge, while passengers scattered into terminals and customs, Solene waited alone at a window overlooking the tarmac. Her scarf rested on the arm of her seat, her coat draped beside her. She opened the envelope then, carefully, slowly. Inside was a handwritten letter, ink slightly smeared at the edge, as if rewritten. It began simply, "Ms. Whitlow, I owe you more than an apology. I owe you honesty." The words belonged to the older man from business class, the one who had once smirked at her name and repeated it under his breath like a joke. The letter traced his discomfort, his biases, his quiet laughter at her expense. But more than that, it admitted something deeper. He envied the confidence she carried, the presence she held, because he had never learned to claim his space without dismissing someone else's. He wrote, "I realized, somewhere between takeoff and landing, that your silence had more weight than all the noise I've ever made." He signed it not with status, not with a company title, but with his full name and a request. "If there's a way to learn better, I'm willing." She folded the letter once, neatly, and placed it back in the envelope. She did not smile, but something eased in her shoulders. Across the lounge, Clara approached once more, this time with less hesitation. She stood tall but nervous, eyes wide with conviction rather than fear. "Ms. Whitlow," she said carefully, I would like to ask for something. Not forgiveness. I don't deserve that, but a chance. A place in the diversity fellowship your company offers. I want to unlearn what I was trained to ignore." Her voice trembled slightly, but did not falter. Solene studied her, not to intimidate, but to understand. She saw not the uniform, not the role, but the intention. And that, finally, was worth something. In the weeks that followed, the repercussions of that flight echoed through the industry. The footage wasn't leaked. The news didn't sensationalize it. But the airline moved, quietly, thoroughly, purposefully. Training programs were overhauled. Hiring protocols were rewritten. Reporting chains for misconduct were streamlined, no longer requiring victims to prove impact before being heard. Solene's role shifted slightly too, not because she demanded it, but because her board asked her to lead it. She launched a global initiative across Skycor's subsidiaries called Presence First. It didn't just train people to see bias. It trained them to challenge systems that upheld it. Clara became one of its first fellows. She later admitted that day on the plane was the worst moment of her life, but also the first day she ever saw herself honestly. The older passenger, retired from his company by then, began volunteering in educational outreach, speaking not about success, but about awareness. "I once laughed at a name," he told one group of high school seniors in a small auditorium. "But that name changed me. It showed me I had never once questioned why I assumed who belonged where." His words weren't dramatic. They weren't flawless. But they were his. And they were real. Soline, meanwhile, returned to the sky often, but never for spectacle. She sat in every section. She spoke to no one unless spoken to. She observed and she remembered. And the system remembered her. Not just her power, but her patience, her precision, her refusal to be defined by anger, even when it was earned. She had not sought revenge. She had chosen evolution. She hadn't asked to be obeyed. She had made herself undeniable. And so, that flight became more than just a memory. It became a blueprint. For those who watched, for those who learned, and for those who understood, finally, that justice doesn't always need a microphone. Sometimes it only needs presence, patience, and one woman in row 36 who chose not to rise, but to rise above. The end. If this story moved you, consider subscribing to stay connected with more powerful narratives like this. Which part of Soline's journey hit you the hardest? Was it the silent endurance, the turning point, or the moment justice finally spoke without a word? Let us know your thoughts in the comments, and share where in the world you're watching from. Your voice matters here.